The flames consumed the parchment with a hungry crackle, orange tongues licking at the cruel words that had reduced a human being to mere kindling. Kevin Mitchell watched the contract burn in his massive hands, the paper curling and blackening as smoke rose between his weathered fingers. The mountain man's jaw was set like granite, his dark eyes reflecting the fire's glow as he spoke words that would change everything. "You are worth more than gold, Amy, worth more than all the timber in these mountains." Amy Mitchell sat in her makeshift wheelchair, carved from pine and fitted with wheels salvaged from an old cart, her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched her bill of sale turn to ash. The woman who had been sold like livestock just hours before could barely comprehend what she was witnessing. This stranger, this giant of a man who lived alone in the wilderness, had just destroyed the legal document that bound her to a fate worse than death. The wind howled through the mountain peaks, carrying the scent of snow and pine as Kevin scattered the ashes with his boot. His cabin stood solid against the storm, its thick log walls a fortress against both the elements and the cruelty of the world below. Inside, the fire in the stone hearth cast dancing shadows across the rough-hewn furniture, creating a warmth that Amy had not felt in years. She had arrived at his door that morning as cargo, delivered by two men who spoke of her as if she were already dead wood. The contract had been clear in its brutal simplicity. One woman, crippled and unable to work, sold to Kevin Mitchell for the price of a winter's worth of firewood, $37.50, the value they had placed on her life. But something had shifted in Kevin's expression as he read those words. Something dark and protective had awakened in the mountain man's chest, a fury that burned hotter than any hearth fire. He had looked at Amy, really looked at her, and seen not a burden to be burned but a soul that deserved dignity. Now, as the last traces of the contract disappeared into the night air, Amy felt tears streaming down her cheeks. She had spent so many years believing what others told her about her worth, accepting that her damaged legs made her less than human. The accident that had crushed her spine when she was 22 had also crushed her spirit, leaving her dependent on the charity of people who grew tired of her presence. Kevin turned from the scattered ashes and knelt beside her wheelchair, his enormous frame somehow gentle as he met her eyes. "I meant what I said, Amy. You are worth more than gold." His voice was rough from years of solitude, but the sincerity in it was unmistakable. No one has the right to sell another human being, especially not someone as strong as you. Strong, the word hit her like a physical blow. When was the last time anyone had called her strong? For 5 years since the accident, she had heard only variations of burden, liability, useless. The people in her small town had whispered about her behind their hands, wondering aloud why she did not just accept her fate and fade away quietly. The storm outside grew more fierce, rattling the cabin's windows and sending snow swirling against the glass. Kevin rose and moved to add another log to the fire, his movements efficient and sure. He had lived alone on this mountain for 8 years, choosing isolation over the judgment and cruelty he had witnessed in civilization below. But tonight that silence felt different. Tonight there was another heartbeat in his sanctuary, another soul seeking shelter from the world's harsh winds. Amy watched him tend the fire, noting the careful way he arranged the logs, the practiced ease with which he coaxed the flames higher. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments. The story of Amy and Kevin is just beginning, and their journey through the harsh mountain winter will test everything they think they know about themselves and each other. Amy's stomach chose that moment to growl audibly, the sound echoing in the cabin's warmth. She pressed a hand to her middle, embarrassed by her body's betrayal. She had not eaten a proper meal in 2 days, surviving on the stale bread and water her cellars had provided for the journey up the mountain. Kevin heard the sound and turned from the fire, his brow furrowing with concern. "When did you last eat?" His question was direct, without judgment, but Amy felt shame wash over her nonetheless. She looked down at her hands, twisted in her lap, and whispered her answer. 2 days ago, maybe 3, I lose track." The mountain man's jaw tightened, and Amy caught a glimpse of the anger that simmered beneath his calm exterior. Not anger at her, she realized, but at the people who had treated her with such callous disregard. Kevin moved to his kitchen area and began pulling ingredients from his stores. "I have venison stew from yesterday," he said, his voice deliberately casual. And fresh bread I baked this morning. Amy watched in amazement as this giant of a man carefully ladled stew into a wooden bowl and cut thick slices of bread with the precision of someone who understood the value of every morsel. He brought the food to her, setting it on a small table he positioned within easy reach of her wheelchair. The aroma that rose from the bowl was heavenly, rich with herbs and vegetables. Amy's hands shook slightly as she lifted the first bite to her lips, partly from hunger and partly from the overwhelming kindness of the gesture. The stew was the most delicious thing she had tasted in years. Not because Kevin was a master chef, but because it was given freely, without expectation or resentment. Each spoonful carried with it a message she was only beginning to understand. You matter. You deserve care. You are not a burden. As she ate, Kevin settled into a chair across from her, whittling a piece of pine with steady strokes of his knife. There was something hypnotic about the way he carved, each cut deliberate and purposeful, slowly revealing the shape hidden within the wood. "What are you making?" she asked between bites, surprised by her own boldness in speaking. Kevin glanced up from his work, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "A bird," he said simply. "A cardinal. I saw one this morning, bright red against the snow. Seemed worth remembering." Amy nodded, understanding more than she could express. In a world that often felt colorless and harsh, the small beauties were worth preserving. She finished her stew in comfortable silence, feeling strength return to her body with each spoonful. "You do not have to serve me," Amy said quietly, guilt creeping into her voice. "I am not helpless." Kevin paused in his washing, considering her words carefully before responding. "I know you are not helpless, but accepting help when it is freely given is not weakness. It is wisdom." The words settled over Amy like a warm blanket, challenging beliefs she had held about herself for years. She had been taught that needing assistance made her a burden, that independence was the only way to maintain dignity. But Kevin's perspective was different, shaped by years of living close to nature where cooperation often meant survival. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountain, but inside the cabin, a different kind of weather was changing. Amy felt a tight knot of shame and self-hatred in her chest beginning to loosen, replaced by something she had not felt in years. Hope. Kevin finished cleaning up and returned to his carving, the soft scrape of his knife against wood creating a peaceful rhythm in the warm room. Amy studied his face in the firelight, noting the lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting against mountain sun and wind. "Why did you come to live up here?" she asked, curiosity overcoming her natural reticence. Kevin's hands stilled for a moment before resuming their work. "Many reasons," he said finally. "Some people are not meant for towns and their rules. Some of us find peace in simpler things." Amy sensed there was more to the story, layers of pain and disappointment that had driven this man to seek solitude among the peaks. But she also understood that trust was something that had to be earned slowly, like the warmth that gradually filled a cold room. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks up the chimney as Kevin continued his carving. Amy found herself studying the cabin's interior more closely, noting the care with which everything had been arranged. The furniture was handmade but skillfully crafted. Each piece fitted perfectly to its purpose. "You made all of this," she observed, gesturing to encompass the room. Kevin nodded, not looking up from his work. "Takes time, but there is plenty of that up here, and it feels good to create something useful with your hands. Something that will last." "Do you ever get lonely?" she asked, then immediately regretted the question. It seemed too personal, too presumptuous. But Kevin did not seem offended. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But loneliness and solitude are different things. I chose to be alone. That makes it easier to bear." A sudden gust of wind rattled the cabin's walls, reminding them both of the storm raging outside. Kevin glanced toward the window, where snow was piling against the glass in thick drifts. "Going to be a heavy one," he said matter-of-factly. "Could last for days." The implication hung in the air between them. Amy would be staying here, in this cabin, with this man she had met only hours ago. Under normal circumstances, the thought would have terrified her, but nothing about her situation was normal, and Kevin had already shown her more kindness than most people she had known for years. "I do not want to be a burden," she said quietly, the old fears rising despite his earlier words. Kevin looked up from his carving, his dark eyes serious. "Amy, listen to me carefully. You are not a burden. You are a person who deserves shelter and warmth and decent food. Anyone who told you otherwise was wrong. The conviction in his voice was absolute, brooking no argument. Amy felt tears prick at her eyes again, overwhelmed by the simple humanity of his statement. How long had it been since someone had spoken to her as if she mattered, as if her presence was not something to be endured but accepted? I used to carve, she said suddenly, surprising herself with the admission. Before the accident, I made little animals for the children in town. Nothing as skilled as yours, but they seemed to like them. Kevin's hands paused in their work, and he looked at her with new interest. What happened to your tools? Amy's face fell as the memory surfaced. I sold them, she whispered. When I could not work anymore, I sold everything I could to pay for food and medicine. The carving tools were among the first things to go. Kevin's jaw tightened again, that familiar flash of anger crossing his features. I have extra tools, he said quietly. If you would like to try again, your hands are not damaged, and carving is something you can do sitting down. Amy stared at him in shock. The idea of creating something again, of feeling useful and productive, was almost too wonderful to believe. Kevin smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. Then you will remember, he said simply. The hands remember what the heart holds dear. Amy felt a flutter of excitement in her chest, a feeling she had not experienced in years. The storm outside seemed to intensify, as if nature itself was conspiring to keep them together in this warm sanctuary. Amy found herself grateful for the weather that had trapped her here, away from the cruel world below. For the first time in years, she felt safe. Kevin finished the cardinal's head and held it up to examine his work in the firelight. The small bird seemed almost alive, its form capturing the essence of the creature he had observed that morning. He handed it to Amy, who received it with reverent care. It is beautiful, she breathed, running her fingers over the smooth wood. The fire burned lower as the evening progressed, casting longer shadows across the cabin's interior. Amy found herself growing drowsy, the warmth and food and emotional exhaustion of the day taking their toll. Kevin noticed her eyelids growing heavy and rose from his chair. You need rest, he said gently. I will make up the bed for you. Amy started to protest, to insist that she could not take his bed, but Kevin held up a hand to stop her. I have slept on worse than the floor, he said, and you need proper support for your back. No arguments. His tone was firm but kind, leaving no room for debate. When he was finished, Kevin helped her transfer from the wheelchair to the bed, his touch respectful and careful. Amy settled into the soft mattress with a sigh of relief, her body finally able to relax fully for the first time in days. Kevin pulled the blankets up to her chin, tucking them around her shoulders. Sleep well, Amy, he said softly. Tomorrow we will see what the storm has brought us. Amy watched as he arranged his own bedroll near the fire, settling down with the easy grace of someone accustomed to sleeping rough. Amy woke to the sound of Kevin moving quietly around the cabin, adding wood to the fire and preparing what smelled like coffee. Pale morning light filtered through the snow-covered windows, creating a soft, ethereal glow. She had slept better than she had in months, her body finally free from the constant tension of uncertainty and fear. Good morning, Kevin said when he noticed she was awake. His voice was warm and welcoming, as if waking up to find her in his cabin was the most natural thing in the world. The storm passed in the night. We got about 2 feet of snow, but the wind has died down. Kevin brought her a cup of coffee, the rich aroma filling her senses with warmth and comfort. It was strong and black, the kind of coffee that could wake the dead. But to Amy, it tasted like hope itself. Thank you, she said, meaning far more than just the coffee. I've been thinking about what you said last night, he began, his eyes serious over the rim of his mug. About your carving. I meant what I said about the tools, but I think there might be something else you could do as well. Something that could help you feel useful again. Kevin rose and moved to one of his bookshelves, pulling down a leather-bound ledger that showed signs of heavy use. I keep records of everything up here, he explained. Weather patterns, animal migrations, which areas are best for trapping in different seasons. But my handwriting is terrible and I am not good with organizing information. Amy nodded slowly, beginning to see where he was leading. I was a school teacher before the accident, she said. I taught children from ages 6 to 14 in our town's one-room schoolhouse. Kevin's eyes lit up with satisfaction. I thought so. There is something about the way you phrase things, the care you take with words. He handed her the ledger and Amy opened it to reveal pages of cramped, barely legible notes interspersed with rough sketches of plants and animals. This is 8 years of notes, he said, settling back into his chair. Everything I have learned about living on this mountain. But it is a mess. Amy felt excitement building in her chest as she flipped through the pages. Here was knowledge that could be invaluable to anyone trying to survive in the wilderness, but it was trapped in Kevin's illegible scrawl and scattered organization. She could see the potential immediately. You want me to rewrite this? She asked, though she already knew the answer. Kevin nodded. Not just rewrite it, organize it, make it into something that could actually help people. Maybe even something that could be published someday, shared with others who want to live off the land. I would love to do this, she said, her voice filled with genuine enthusiasm. It would be like teaching again, in a way, helping to preserve and share knowledge. Kevin smiled, pleased by her reaction. There is no rush, he said. We have all winter and probably longer if you are willing to stay. Amy looked around the cabin, taking in the warmth and safety and acceptance she had found here. Below the mountain, there was nothing for her but rejection and pity. Here, she had already found more kindness in one day than she had experienced in years. I would like to stay, she said quietly, if you will have me. Kevin's smile widened, transforming his weathered features. Then it is settled, he said. We are partners now. You will help me with the records, and I will teach you everything I know about surviving up here. We will both be stronger for the arrangement. They spent the morning discussing the project, Kevin explaining his system of observation and record keeping, while Amy began to see patterns and connections he had not noticed. Her teacher's mind immediately began organizing the information into logical categories. By midday, Amy was seated at Kevin's small table with paper and pen, beginning the process of transcribing his notes into legible text. Her handwriting was neat and precise, a product of years spent writing lessons on chalkboards for young students. Kevin watched her work with satisfaction, pleased to see his rough observations transformed into clear, useful prose. As she worked, Amy found herself asking questions about Kevin's experiences, seeking clarification on his methods and reasoning. Their conversation flowed naturally, teacher and student roles shifting back and forth as they explored the intricacies of mountain survival. The afternoon passed quickly, both of them absorbed in their work. Kevin spent his time checking and maintaining his traps, preparing for the next phase of winter hunting. Amy continued transcribing, occasionally pausing to ask questions or seek clarification on particularly cryptic notes. As evening approached, Kevin began preparing dinner, while Amy organized the pages she had completed. She was amazed by how much she had accomplished in just one day, how good it felt to be productive again. The sense of purpose that had been missing from her life for so long was returning. Over dinner, they discussed their progress and planned the next day's work. Kevin had decided to teach Amy some basic wilderness skills, things that would help her contribute more to their survival and give her additional confidence in her abilities. You know, Kevin said as they finished their meal, I have lived alone up here for 8 years. I thought I preferred it that way. But having someone to share the work with, someone to talk to about ideas and plans, it makes everything feel different. Better. That night, as they settled into their respective sleeping areas, Amy reflected on the dramatic change in her circumstances. 24 hours ago, she had been cargo, sold like firewood to a stranger. Now she was a partner, valued for her mind and abilities rather than dismissed for her limitations. The next few weeks fell into a comfortable routine that surprised both Amy and Kevin with its natural ease. Each morning, Kevin would tend to his traps and check his weather instruments while Amy worked on transcribing and organizing his notes. In the afternoons, he would teach her practical skills, adapting his lessons to accommodate her limitations while never making her feel incapable. Amy learned to identify edible plants from Kevin's detailed sketches, memorizing their seasonal availability and preparation methods. She mastered the art of preserving meat, understanding how salt and smoke could extend their food supplies through the harsh winter months. Kevin taught her to read weather signs in the ski and wind patterns. Most importantly, Kevin taught her to see her wheelchair not as a limitation, but as a tool that could be adapted for different purposes. Together, they modified it with hooks and baskets that allowed her to carry supplies and equipment. What had once been a symbol of her disability became an extension of her capabilities. Amy's confidence grew with each passing day. The project of organizing Kevin's notes had evolved into something much larger, a comprehensive guide to mountain survival that drew on both his practical experience and her educational background. She found herself contributing insights and observations that Kevin had missed. One particularly cold morning, as Amy worked on a chapter about winter hunting techniques, Kevin burst through the cabin door with unusual urgency. His face was grim, his jaw set in the hard line Amy had learned to recognize as trouble. "We have visitors coming up the mountain," Kevin said without preamble. "3 men on horseback, moving fast despite the snow. They are not trappers or hunters." Amy felt her blood turn to ice in her veins. She knew with terrible certainty who those men must be. Kevin seemed to read her thoughts. "The men who sold you?" he asked, his voice deadly quiet. Amy nodded, unable to speak past the fear that had suddenly constricted her throat. Kevin's expression darkened further. "They probably think they can reclaim their property," he said with disgust. He went to a locked chest in the corner of the cabin and withdrew a rifle, checking its load with practiced efficiency. Amy had seen the weapon before, but had never seen Kevin handle it with such lethal intent. His movements were those of a man who knew how to use violence when necessary. "Kevin," she said urgently, "you do not understand. These are not good men. Robert Harris, the one who arranged the sale, he has connections with the territorial marshal. If you fight them, you could be branded an outlaw." Kevin paused in his preparations and looked at her with something approaching amusement. "Amy, I have been branded worse things than outlaw." The sound of horses could be heard approaching through the snow, their hoofbeats muffled but unmistakable. Kevin positioned himself near the window where he could see the approaching riders while remaining concealed. Amy felt panic rising in her chest as the reality of the situation hit her. The riders came into view through the cabin's window, 3 men bundled in heavy coats and scarves against the cold. Amy recognized Robert Harris immediately, his bulky frame unmistakable even at a distance. The other 2 were his associates, men who did Robert's dirty work without question or conscience. Kevin watched them approach with the stillness of a predator, his rifle ready but not yet visible to the approaching men. Amy could see the calculation in his eyes, the way he was assessing threats and planning responses. Whatever his history, it was clear that Kevin had faced dangerous men before. The riders stopped about 20 yards from the cabin, close enough to be heard but far enough to avoid immediate confrontation. Robert Harris dismounted and stepped forward, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "Mitchell," he called out, "we know you are in there. We have come for what belongs to us." Kevin stepped into view at the window, his rifle clearly visible now. "Amy does not belong to anyone," he called back, his voice steady and uncompromising. "She is a free woman under my protection. You have no business here." Robert's face twisted with anger and frustration. "We have a legal contract," he shouted. Kevin's laugh was harsh and without humor. "Property," he repeated with disgust. "You are talking about a human being, not a piece of livestock. Your contract is worthless, Harris. I suggest you turn around and ride back down the mountain while you still can." But Robert Harris was not easily intimidated. "You are making a mistake, Mitchell," he called out. "I have friends in the territorial government. You interfere with a legal transaction, and you will find yourself on the wrong side of the law." Kevin's expression did not change, but Amy caught a glimpse of something cold and dangerous in his eyes. "I have been on the wrong side of the law before," Kevin replied calmly. "It does not frighten me as much as you might think. What should frighten you is what happens if you try to take Amy from this cabin. She is under my protection now, and I take my responsibilities seriously." Robert Harris looked around at the snow-covered landscape, clearly weighing his options. He had expected to find a simple mountain man who could be bullied or bribed into compliance. Instead, he was facing someone who showed no fear and seemed perfectly willing to use violence if necessary. Robert Harris stepped closer to the cabin, his face flushed with anger and cold. "You think you can hide behind that rifle forever, Mitchell," he shouted, "but you cannot stay up here all winter. Eventually, you will have to come down, and when you do, I will be waiting." Kevin's response was calm and measured, but Amy could hear the steel beneath his words. Harris, I'm going to give you one chance to leave peacefully. Take your men and ride back down the mountain. Forget about Amy and find some other way to make your money. Because if you try to take her from here, I promise you will regret it. The standoff stretched on, tension crackling in the cold air like electricity before a storm. Amy watched from her position near the window, her heart pounding so hard she was sure the men outside could hear it. She had never seen Kevin like this, cold and dangerous, every line of his body radiating controlled violence. Finally, Robert made his choice. "You are making a big mistake, Mitchell," he called out, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "This is not over. I will be back with legal authority, and then we will see how tough you really are." He turned and stalked back to his horse, his movements sharp with frustrated anger. Kevin watched the three men mount their horses and begin the journey back down the mountain, his rifle never wavering until they were completely out of sight. Only then did he lower the weapon and turn back to Amy, his expression softening as he saw the fear and relief warring in her face. Amy felt tears of relief streaming down her cheeks, the emotional toll of the confrontation hitting her all at once. She had been so afraid that Kevin would be hurt defending her, or that she would be dragged away from the first real home she had known in years. Kevin set his rifle aside and moved to kneel beside her wheelchair, his large hands gentle as they covered hers. "Amy, look at me," he said softly. She raised her eyes to meet his, seeing nothing but determination and compassion in his gaze. "I meant what I said out there. You are under my protection now." "But he will come back," Amy whispered, her voice shaking with emotion. "Robert Harris does not give up easily, and if he brings the marshal, if he has legal documents." Kevin's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm and reassuring. "Then we will deal with that when it happens." There was something in Kevin's tone that suggested depths to his story that Amy had not yet explored. She had sensed from the beginning that he was more than just a simple mountain man, that there were layers to his past that remained hidden. Kevin rose and began pacing the cabin, his mind clearly working through possibilities and contingencies. "We need to be prepared for their return," he said, his voice taking on a planning tone. "They will probably come back with more men, maybe even legal authority. We need to think about our options." "What options do we have?" she asked, though she feared the answer. Kevin stopped his pacing and looked at her seriously. "We could leave," he said, "pack up everything essential and head deeper into the mountains. I know places where no one would think to look for us." The idea of fleeing deeper into the wilderness was both appealing and terrifying. Amy had grown comfortable in Kevin's cabin, had begun to think of it as home. The thought of leaving behind the warmth and safety they had built together was painful. "Or," Kevin continued, his voice taking on a harder edge, "we could stay and fight. Make it clear to Harris and anyone else that you are not property to be bought and sold. Sometimes the only way to stop a bully is to stand up to him completely." "There is a third option," she said quietly, the words painful to speak but necessary to consider. "I could go with them, end this before anyone gets hurt." Kevin's reaction was immediate and explosive. "Absolutely not," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You are not sacrificing yourself to protect me." The vehemence of his response surprised her, revealing depths of feeling that Kevin had not previously expressed. Amy realized that somewhere in the past few weeks, their partnership had evolved into something deeper, something that neither of them had fully acknowledged. Kevin resumed his pacing, his agitation clear in every movement. "I should have killed him," he muttered, more to himself than to Amy. "Should have ended it right there instead of letting him ride away to gather reinforcements." "Kevin," she said carefully, "who are you really? I mean, I know you are a trapper and you live alone on this mountain. But the way you handled that rifle, the way you spoke to those men, it was like you have done this before." "I was a soldier," he said finally, the words seeming to cost him effort. "Served in the territorial militia for 6 years before I came up here. Saw enough fighting and killing to last several lifetimes. When my service ended, I wanted nothing more than to find a place where I could live in peace. But peace has a way of finding you even when you try to hide from it." Kevin continued, his voice heavy with old pain. "Some fights you cannot avoid, no matter how far you run, and some things are worth fighting for." He looked directly at Amy as he spoke the last words. The implications of his statement hung in the air between them, unspoken but understood. Kevin was willing to fight for her, to risk everything he had built in his mountain sanctuary to protect her freedom. The knowledge was both humbling and overwhelming. They spent the rest of the day making preparations for whatever might come. Kevin cleaned and checked his weapons, while Amy worked on organizing their most important possessions. The peaceful routine they had established was shattered, replaced by the urgent efficiency of people preparing for war. As evening approached, Kevin built up the fire and prepared a simple meal, but neither of them had much appetite. The confrontation with Robert Harris had changed everything, forcing them to confront realities they had been content to ignore. That night, as they prepared for sleep, Kevin made an announcement that surprised Amy. "I am not sleeping by the fire tonight," he said matter-of-factly. "I am going to keep watch from the window. If Harris is smart, he will wait until morning to make his next move. You do not have to do this," she said softly. "I never meant to bring trouble into your life." Kevin's expression softened as he looked at her. "Amy, you did not bring trouble. Trouble was already here, in the form of men who think they can buy and sell human beings. You just gave me a reason to do something about it." Sleep came fitfully for Amy that night, filled with dreams of pursuit and capture. She woke several times to find Kevin still at his post by the window, silhouetted against the starlight like a guardian angel carved from shadow and determination. Dawn brought no sign of Robert Harris and his men, but Kevin remained tense and watchful. He prepared breakfast with one eye on the window, his rifle within easy reach at all times. Amy could see the strain beginning to show in his face, the toll that constant alertness was taking. As the morning progressed, Kevin made a decision that surprised Amy. "We are going to take a walk," he announced, checking his rifle and slinging it across his shoulder. "I want to show you something that might be important later." Kevin helped her into her wheelchair and pushed it outside into the crisp mountain air. The snow crunched under the wheels as they made their way along a path that Amy had not noticed before, winding through the trees toward what looked like a sheer rock face. "This is a cave system that runs deep into the mountain," Kevin explained as they approached the entrance. "I discovered it during my second winter here. It has multiple chambers and at least 3 different exits that I know of. If we ever need to disappear quickly, this is where we would go." Kevin produced a lantern from somewhere and lit it, the flame casting dancing shadows on the cave walls as they entered. The passage was narrow at first, but quickly opened into a larger chamber that showed signs of previous use. Amy could see that Kevin had stored supplies here. "There are blankets and food cached throughout the system," Kevin explained as he guided her wheelchair through the passages. "Fresh water from an underground spring. Even some of my backup tools and weapons. If we had to, we could live down here for months without anyone finding us." The tour took most of the morning, with Kevin showing her landmarks and teaching her to recognize the key passages. By the time they returned to the cabin, Amy felt more confident about their options if flight became necessary. Midday brought visitors, but not the ones they had been expecting. A lone rider approached the cabin, moving slowly and openly in a way that suggested peaceful intentions. Kevin watched through the window as the figure drew closer, his rifle ready but not yet raised. "It is Janet Collins," he said, surprise evident in his voice. "She runs the trading post at the base of the mountain. I did not expect to see her up here in winter." Amy felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Another person meant potential help, but it also meant their situation was becoming more complicated. Kevin stepped outside to greet Janet as she dismounted from her horse, a sturdy mountain pony that showed the effects of a hard climb through the snow. Janet Collins was a woman in her 50s, weathered by years of frontier life, but still vital and strong. "I heard about the trouble you might be having," Janet said without preamble, her voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "Thought you should know that Robert Harris has been talking to anyone who will listen down in town, making all kinds of threats and promises." Kevin invited Janet inside, and Amy got her first close look at the woman who ran the trading post. Janet Collins had the practical air of someone who had spent her life dealing with difficult people and situations. Her eyes were sharp and intelligent, missing nothing as she took in the cabin's interior and Amy's presence. "Miss Amy," Janet said with a respectful nod, "I am sorry for the circumstances that brought you here, but I want you to know that not everyone down the mountain agrees with what was done to you. There are good people who think Robert Harris went too far this time." Janet turned back to Kevin, her expression serious. You need to know that Harris is not just making noise, she said quietly. He rode down to the territorial capital yesterday. Word is he is trying to get official backing for his claim. If he comes back with a marshal and legal papers, it will be much harder to resist him. There is something else, Janet continued, her voice dropping even lower. I heard rumors that Harris has been talking to some unsavory characters, men who would not hesitate to use violence if the legal approach fails. You might be facing more than just official pressure. Amy watched the exchange with growing dread, understanding that their peaceful interlude was truly over. The forces arrayed against them were too powerful to resist through simple defiance. Something would have to give, and she feared it would be Kevin who paid the price for her freedom. Janet Collins stayed for another hour, sharing what information she could about the situation developing in the valley below. The picture she painted was not encouraging. Robert Harris had indeed stirred up significant support for his position, playing on people's respect for legal contracts and property rights. But there was also opposition to Harris's actions, Janet explained. Several prominent citizens had spoken out against the practice of selling disabled people like livestock. The local minister had even delivered a sermon about the dignity of all human beings. The community was divided. As Janet prepared to leave, she pulled Kevin aside for a private conversation. Amy could not hear their words, but she could see the serious expressions on both their faces. Whatever Janet was telling him was clearly important, possibly crucial to their survival. After Janet rode away, Kevin returned to the cabin with a thoughtful expression. Amy waited for him to share what he had learned, but Kevin seemed reluctant to speak. Finally, she could not stand the suspense any longer. What did she tell you? Amy asked. Kevin sat down heavily in his chair, suddenly looking older than his years. Janet has offered to help us, he said slowly. She has connections with people who oppose Harris, and she thinks they might be willing to provide assistance. But it would mean going public with our story. Amy considered this option carefully. The idea of having their personal struggle become a public spectacle was daunting, but it might be their only hope of defeating Robert Harris's legal maneuvering. If they could win the court of public opinion, it might influence any official decisions. What kind of assistance? She asked. Kevin's expression was troubled as he answered. Legal help, possibly. Maybe even sanctuary if things go badly. But Amy, you need to understand what this would mean. Your story would become public knowledge. People would know about your disability, about being sold like property. There is something else, Kevin continued, his voice even more reluctant. Janet thinks that if we are going to fight this publicly, we need to get married. Legally, a husband has rights over his wife's welfare that would supersede any previous contracts. It would give us a legal foundation to stand on. The word marriage hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Amy stared at Kevin in shock, trying to process what he had just suggested. Marriage had been something she had given up on years ago, convinced that no man would want a woman with her limitations. Kevin seemed to misinterpret her silence as rejection. I know it is not ideal, he said quickly, a marriage of convenience rather than love. But Amy, it might be our only legal option. I would not expect anything from you beyond what you were willing to give. Amy's mind raced as she tried to think through the implications. Marriage to Kevin would solve their immediate legal problems, but it would also create new complications. What would happen when the crisis was over? Would they remain married out of obligation, or would Kevin seek to have the union dissolved? But even as these practical concerns swirled through her mind, Amy found herself thinking about the past few weeks, the easy companionship they had developed, the way Kevin treated her as an equal partner rather than a burden. If she was honest with herself, the idea of being married to Kevin was appealing. I need time to think, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Kevin nodded understanding. Of course, he said gently. It is a big decision, and there is no rush. We have a few days before we need to make any final choices. But Amy, whatever you decide, I want you to know that I will stand by you regardless. That evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, the weight of their decision hung heavy in the air. Kevin worked on his carving while Amy pretended to read, but neither could concentrate on their tasks. The comfortable routine they had established was disrupted by the specter of choices that would determine their entire future. Kevin, she said suddenly, breaking the silence that had stretched between them, why are you willing to do this? I mean, really willing. You could just help me escape to the caves and avoid all the legal complications. Why risk marriage and everything that comes with it? Kevin's hands stilled on his carving as he considered her question. For a long moment he was quiet, and Amy wondered if she had overstepped some boundary. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but clear. Because you are worth it, Amy. Worth the risk, worth the complications, worth standing up to men like Robert Harris. I have never thought of myself as worth much trouble, she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. Since the accident, I have felt like a burden on everyone around me. The idea that someone would choose to take on my problems voluntarily is hard to accept. Kevin set down his carving and looked at her directly, his dark eyes serious. Amy, he said firmly, you are not a burden. You are a partner, a companion, someone who has made my life better in the short time you have been here. The work we do together, the conversations we share, the simple presence of another person who understands the value of this place, all of that has meaning. Kevin rose from his chair and knelt beside her wheelchair, taking her hands in his large calloused ones. Amy, he said softly, I cannot promise you a traditional marriage or a conventional life, but I can promise you respect, partnership, and protection for as long as you want them. If you are willing to take that risk with me, I would be honored to call you my wife. Amy looked into Kevin's eyes and saw nothing but sincerity and determination. This man, who had already saved her from a fate worse than death, was offering her something she had never dared to hope for. Not just protection, but genuine partnership with someone who saw her as an equal. Yes, she whispered, her voice barely audible but filled with a conviction. Yes, Kevin, I will marry you. Kevin's face lit up with a smile that transformed his weathered features, and Amy felt her heart skip at the sight. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, as partners in every sense of the word. The next morning brought a flurry of activity as Kevin and Amy began preparing for both their wedding and the confrontation that was sure to follow. Kevin rode down to Janet Collins's trading post to arrange for a minister and witnesses, while Amy worked on making herself presentable for the ceremony. Janet proved to be a valuable ally in their preparations. She not only arranged for Reverend Stephen Green to perform the ceremony, but also gathered a small group of supporters who were willing to serve as witnesses and character references. The speed with which she organized everything was impressive. The wedding was set for the following afternoon, giving them just enough time to make the necessary arrangements while hopefully staying ahead of Robert Harris's return. Kevin had decided that they would hold the ceremony at Janet's trading post, which was more accessible than his mountain cabin. Amy spent the morning of her wedding day in a state of nervous excitement. She had never imagined that she would marry under such circumstances, but she also could not imagine marrying anyone other than Kevin. The man who had seen her worth when others saw only burden had become the center of her world. The ceremony itself was simple but moving. Reverend Green spoke eloquently about the nature of marriage as a partnership between equals, words that seemed particularly meaningful given Amy's recent experiences. Kevin's vows were brief but heartfelt, promising to honor and protect Amy for as long as they both lived. As Reverend Green pronounced them husband and wife, Amy felt a transformation that went beyond the legal change in her status. For the first time since her accident, she felt truly valued and protected. Kevin's kiss was gentle but firm, sealing their partnership with a tenderness that spoke of genuine affection. The celebration that followed was modest but joyful. Janet had prepared a simple meal, and the witnesses shared stories and offered congratulations. Amy found herself laughing for the first time in years, caught up in the warmth and acceptance of the small community that had gathered around them. But reality intruded when one of Janet's customers arrived with disturbing news. Robert Harris had been seen riding back up the mountain that morning, accompanied by a man wearing a federal marshal's badge and at least 4 armed deputies. The legal challenge they had been expecting was about to become a reality. The ride back up the mountain was tense and silent. Amy sat in the cart Kevin had borrowed from Janet, her wedding dress a stark contrast to the grim purpose of their journey. Kevin rode beside her, his rifle across his saddle and his eyes constantly scanning the trail ahead. They reached the cabin as the sun was setting, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of orange and gold. Kevin helped Amy back into her wheelchair, and they entered their home together for the first time as husband and wife. The familiar warmth of the cabin was comforting. That night, they held each other for the first time, not as lovers, but as partners facing an uncertain future together. Kevin's arms around her were strong and protective, and Amy felt safer than she had since childhood. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it as a united front. The morning brought the sound of many horses approaching through the snow. Kevin rose from their bed and moved to the window, his face grim as he counted the riders. 8 men in total, including Robert Harris and a man whose badge gleamed in the morning sunlight. The federal marshal, a tall man with graying hair and a stern expression, dismounted and stepped forward. His voice carried clearly in the cold air as he made his announcement. "Kevin Mitchell," he called out. "I am United States Marshal Paul Gomez. I have a federal warrant for the return of property unlawfully taken from Robert Harris." Kevin stepped into view at the cabin door, Amy's marriage certificate clearly visible in his hand. "Marshal Gomez," he replied. "My name is Kevin Mitchell, and this is Amy Mitchell, my lawfully wedded wife. She is not property to be returned, but a free citizen under the protection of federal law." The marshal's expression showed surprise and frustration as Kevin's words sank in. A marriage would indeed complicate the legal situation significantly, potentially invalidating any previous contracts or claims. Robert Harris could be seen arguing urgently with the marshal. Marshal Gomez studied the marriage certificate that Kevin held up, even from a distance, able to see the official seals and signatures that made it legally binding. After a long moment of consultation with his deputies, the marshal made a decision that surprised everyone present. "Mr. Mitchell," he called out, "I am going to need to examine that marriage certificate and speak with both you and your wife. If the marriage is legitimate and properly documented, it may indeed supersede the previous contract. Are you willing to allow me to verify the documents and conduct interviews?" Kevin looked back at Amy, seeking her agreement before responding. Amy nodded, understanding that cooperation might be their best chance of resolving the situation peacefully. Kevin turned back to the marshal and made his decision. "You may approach, Marshal Gomez, but you come alone and you leave your weapons with your men." Marshal Paul Gomez considered Kevin's terms carefully before nodding his agreement. He handed his rifle to one of his deputies and unbuckled his sidearm, placing it carefully on his saddle before walking toward the cabin. His movements were deliberate and non-threatening. Kevin opened the cabin door and stepped aside to allow the marshal entry, but his posture remained alert and ready for trouble. Amy sat in her wheelchair near the fire, the marriage certificate spread on the table before her along with other documents that supported their case. Marshal Gomez removed his hat as he entered the cabin, his eyes taking in the domestic scene before him. The interior was warm and comfortable, showing clear signs of being a shared home rather than a prison or hiding place. Amy's presence seemed natural and unforced. "Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell," the marshal said formally, "I need to examine your marriage certificate and ask some questions about the circumstances of your union. I want to be clear that I am here to determine the legal facts, not to make moral judgments about anyone's actions." Kevin handed over the marriage certificate, along with the documentation from Reverend Green and the signed statements from their witnesses. Marshal Gomez studied the papers carefully, his experienced eye checking for any signs of forgery or irregularity. "These documents appear to be in order," he said slowly. "The marriage was performed by a licensed minister with proper witnesses and recorded according to territorial law. Mrs. Mitchell, I need to ask you directly, did you enter into this marriage of your own free will, without coercion or duress?" Amy met the marshal's gaze steadily, drawing on reserves of strength she had not known she possessed. "Marshal Gomez," she said clearly, "I married Kevin Mitchell because he is a good man who treated me with dignity and respect when others saw me only as a burden. No one forced me to marry him." The marshal continued his questioning for another hour, probing the details of Amy's sale and Kevin's intervention. Amy found herself recounting the humiliation of being sold like livestock, the desperation that had led her to accept such treatment, and the transformation she had experienced under Kevin's care. Finally, Marshal Gomez closed his notebook and stood to leave. "Based on my investigation," he announced, "I find that the marriage between Kevin and Amy Mitchell is legitimate and legally binding. Under territorial law, this marriage supersedes any previous contracts or agreements regarding Mrs. Mitchell's status." Amy felt a wave of relief so intense it was almost physical. The legal nightmare that had threatened to destroy their happiness was over, defeated by the simple act of two people choosing to commit themselves to each other. Kevin's gamble had paid off, and they were truly free. But Marshall Gomez was not finished. However, he continued, his tone becoming more serious. I must warn you both that this situation has created significant tension in the community below. Mr. Harris and his supporters are not likely to accept this resolution quietly. Kevin nodded grimly, understanding that their victory came with ongoing risks. Marshall, he said, I appreciate your fair handling of this situation. But I want you to know that Amy and I are prepared to defend ourselves if necessary. We will not be driven from our home by threats or intimidation. After the marshal left to inform Robert Harris and his men of his decision, Kevin and Amy sat in their cabin processing what had just occurred. They were legally safe, but the marshal's warning about continued trouble was sobering. Their marriage had solved the immediate crisis, but had not eliminated the underlying hostility. Outside, they could hear raised voices as Robert Harris argued with Marshal Gomez about the decision. Harris's fury was evident even through the cabin walls, his sense of injustice and financial loss fueling his anger. Amy knew that this would not be the end of their troubles. Kevin seemed to share her concerns. We have won this battle, he said quietly, but the war may just be beginning. Harris is not the type of man to accept defeat gracefully, and he has allies who share his views about property and contracts. We need to be prepared for whatever comes next. Amy reached for Kevin's hand, drawing strength from his solid presence. Whatever comes, she said firmly, we will face it together. I am not the same woman who was sold like firewood a month ago. I am Amy Mitchell now, and I have a husband who believes in my worth. Kevin squeezed her hand gently, his eyes reflecting the same determination that had driven him to burn her contract of sale. You are right, he said. You are not the same woman, and I am not the same man. We are partners now, in every sense of the word, and partners do not abandon each other when things get difficult. The sound of horses departing told them that Marshal Gomez and his men were leaving, taking Robert Harris and his supporters back down the mountain. But Amy knew that this was not the end of their story, merely the end of one chapter. There would be other challenges, other threats to their happiness and security. That evening, as they prepared dinner together, Amy reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this point. From being sold as firewood to becoming a married woman with legal rights and a partner who valued her contributions, the transformation seemed almost miraculous. Kevin, she said as they sat down to eat, I want you to know that marrying you was not just a legal necessity for me. It was a choice I made because I love the man you are and the life we are building together. I know our marriage began as a practical arrangement, but I hope it can become something more. Kevin's smile was warm and genuine as he reached across the table to take her hand. Amy, he said softly, our marriage may have begun as a solution to a problem, but it has already become the best decision I have ever made. I love you too, not as an obligation or a burden, but as the remarkable woman who has made my life complete. The weeks that followed their legal victory brought a gradual return to the peaceful routine that Amy and Kevin had established. Amy continued her work on Kevin's survival guide, which had grown into a comprehensive manual that documented not just practical skills, but also the philosophy of living in harmony with the natural world. Their marriage deepened naturally as they shared the daily tasks of mountain life. Amy's confidence continued to grow as she mastered new skills and contributed more substantially to their survival. Kevin had taught her to identify animal tracks in the snow, to predict weather patterns from cloud formations, and to preserve food using traditional methods. Spring's arrival brought both joy and renewed concern. The melting snow would make travel easier, which meant that Robert Harris and his allies would have better access to the mountain. Kevin had heard through Janet Collins that Harris was still bitter about his defeat and had been making threats about settling the score. But spring also brought visitors of a more welcome nature. Word of Amy and Kevin's story had spread throughout the territory, carried by travelers and traders who had heard various versions of the tale. Some came seeking Kevin's wilderness expertise. Others were curious about the woman who had been sold as firewood and lived to tell about it. One visitor proved particularly significant. Dr. Stephen Green, a physician from the territorial capital, arrived in early May with a specific interest in Amy's condition. He had heard about her paralysis and wanted to examine her to see if anything could be done to improve her mobility. Amy was initially reluctant to submit to such an examination, having been told by previous doctors that her condition was hopeless. But Kevin encouraged her to at least listen to what Dr. Green had to say. Medical knowledge was advancing rapidly, and techniques that had been unknown 5 years ago might now offer hope. Dr. Green's examination was thorough and respectful, conducted with Amy fully clothed and Kevin present throughout. The physician asked detailed questions about the accident that had caused her paralysis and the treatments she had received in the immediate aftermath. After completing his examination, Dr. Green surprised Amy with his assessment. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said carefully, "I believe that your paralysis may not be as complete or permanent as you have been told. The damage to your spine was significant, but I can detect some sensation and muscle response that suggests partial rather than total nerve damage." Amy stared at the doctor in shock, hardly daring to hope that his words might mean what she thought they meant. "Are you saying that I might be able to walk again?" she whispered, her voice trembling with suppressed emotion. Dr. Green held up a cautionary hand. "I am saying that with proper treatment and rehabilitation, you might regain some degree of mobility." The possibility was almost too wonderful to believe. Amy had accepted her paralysis as permanent, had built her new identity around the limitations it imposed. The idea that those limitations might not be absolute was both thrilling and terrifying. Kevin seemed to sense her concerns and moved to kneel beside her wheelchair. "Amy," he said gently, "whatever Dr. Green can do to help you, we will pursue it together. But I want you to know that my feelings for you have nothing to do with your legs or your ability to walk. I fell in love with your mind, your spirit, your courage." Dr. Green outlined a treatment plan that would require several months of intensive therapy, including exercises designed to stimulate nerve function and strengthen atrophied muscles. Some of the treatment could be done at the cabin, but Amy would need to spend time at the doctor's clinic in the territorial capital. They decided to begin the treatment program in the fall, after the summer trapping season was complete. This would give Amy time to finish the survival guide and Kevin time to prepare their affairs for an extended absence. The decision felt momentous, marking the beginning of a new chapter in their lives together. As summer progressed, Amy threw herself into completing the survival guide with renewed energy. The project had become more than just a transcription of Kevin's notes. It was now a comprehensive resource that combined his practical knowledge with her educational skills. Publishers in the territorial capital had already expressed interest in the completed work. The summer also brought news that Robert Harris had suffered a series of business reversals that had significantly reduced his influence and resources. Several of his associates had distanced themselves from him after learning more details about Amy's sale, and his reputation in the community had been severely damaged. Janet Collins reported that public opinion had shifted decisively in favor of Amy and Kevin's position. The story of their romance had captured the imagination of the territory's residents, who saw it as a triumph of love over cruelty and greed. Amy had become a symbol of resilience and dignity, while Kevin was viewed as a hero. As autumn approached, Amy felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension about the medical treatment that lay ahead. The possibility of regaining some mobility was incredibly appealing, but she was also afraid of being disappointed if the treatment failed to produce results. The survival guide was completed in late September, a comprehensive manual that documented everything from basic shelter construction to advanced hunting techniques. Amy had organized Kevin's knowledge into clear, logical sections that made the information accessible to readers with varying levels of wilderness experience. Several publishers had already made offers for the guide, recognizing its potential value to the growing number of settlers seeking to establish homesteads in remote areas. Amy and Kevin decided to accept an offer from a publisher in Denver who specialized in practical manuals and had a reputation for quality production. As they prepared to leave for the territorial capital and Amy's medical treatment, both felt a sense of completion and anticipation. They had survived the crisis that had brought them together and had built something beautiful and lasting from the ashes of Amy's former life. The morning of their departure dawned clear and cold, with the first hints of winter already visible in the mountain peaks. Kevin loaded their supplies into the wagon he had borrowed from Janet Collins, making sure that Amy would be comfortable for the long journey down the mountain. "This is not goodbye," Kevin said softly, understanding her emotions. "This is just the next chapter in our story. We will be back, and when we return, we will be stronger than ever." Amy nodded, feeling tears of gratitude and love for the man who had given her so much more than just freedom. He had given her a future worth living. The journey to the territorial capital took 5 days, traveling slowly to ensure Amy's comfort and safety. Kevin had modified the wagon with extra padding and supports that allowed her to rest comfortably during the long hours on rough mountain roads. They stopped frequently to stretch and rest, turning the journey into an extended honeymoon. Dr. Green's clinic was located in a modern building near the center of town, equipped with the latest medical equipment and staffed by trained nurses who specialize in rehabilitation therapy. Amy was impressed by the professional atmosphere and the obvious competence of the medical team. The initial phase of treatment was gentle but intensive, focusing on exercises designed to stimulate nerve function and improve circulation in Amy's legs. Dr. Green explained each procedure carefully, helping Amy understand how the various treatments were intended to work. Progress was slow at first, with Amy experiencing only minor improvements in sensation and muscle response. But Dr. Green remained optimistic, explaining that nerve regeneration was a gradual process that required patience and persistence. Amy found the daily routine of exercises exhausting but also strangely hopeful. After 6 weeks of treatment, Amy experienced her first major breakthrough. During a routine exercise session, she was able to move her left toe voluntarily for the first time since her accident. The movement was slight and required enormous effort, but it was unmistakably under her conscious control. Dr. Green was equally excited by this development, explaining that voluntary movement indicated that the nerve pathways were beginning to function again. He adjusted Amy's treatment plan to focus more intensively on the areas showing improvement, while continuing to work on stimulating response in other regions. By Christmas, Amy was able to move both feet and had regained significant sensation in her lower legs. She could not yet support her weight, but the improvement was dramatic enough to give everyone involved tremendous hope for continued progress. Kevin arranged to extend their stay at the clinic through the winter. The winter months in the territorial capital proved to be a time of unexpected growth for both Amy and Kevin. Away from the isolation of their mountain cabin, they were exposed to new ideas and experiences that broadened their perspectives. Amy began giving lectures about wilderness survival to women's groups. Spring brought the most dramatic breakthrough yet. During a routine therapy session, Amy was able to stand upright with assistance for nearly a minute. Her legs were weak and unsteady, but they were supporting her weight for the first time in over 6 years. The emotional impact of this achievement was overwhelming. By late spring, Amy was able to walk short distances with the aid of specially designed crutches. Her gait was unsteady and she tired easily, but the simple act of moving under her own power was incredibly liberating. Kevin was beside himself with joy at her progress. The question of returning to their mountain cabin became a topic of ongoing discussion. Amy's medical treatment was essentially complete, having achieved results that surpassed everyone's expectations. But their new life in the territorial capital had also proven rewarding. They ultimately decided to maintain homes in both locations, spending summers on the mountain and winters in town. This arrangement would allow them to continue their wilderness lifestyle while also pursuing their educational and business interests. Their return to the mountain cabin in early summer was triumphant, marking the completion of a journey that had transformed both their lives in fundamental ways. Amy was able to walk from the wagon to the cabin door under her own power, a symbolic homecoming that represented her complete transformation. The cabin felt both familiar and different, unchanged physically, but imbued with new meaning by their experiences and growth. Amy and Kevin settled back into their mountain routine, but now as equals in mobility as well as partnership. Amy could assist with tasks that had previously been impossible for her. Their story had become legend throughout the territory, inspiring other couples facing similar challenges and serving as a powerful example of love's ability to overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. Amy had become a symbol of resilience and determination, while Kevin was celebrated as a man who had seen worth where others saw only burden. As they sat together on their cabin porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the mountain peaks in shades of gold and crimson, Amy reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this point. From being sold as Firewood to becoming a successful author and teacher, from paralysis to mobility, the transformation seemed almost miraculous. But Amy knew that their success had not been the result of magic or luck. It had been built on Kevin's courage and standing up for what was right, her own determination to reclaim her dignity and worth, and their mutual commitment to building something beautiful together. Kevin reached for her hand as they watched the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. "Amy," he said softly, "do you ever regret the path that brought us together? I know it was painful and humiliating, but without Robert Harris's cruelty, we might never have met." Amy considered his question carefully before responding. "I regret the pain and humiliation," she said finally, "but I cannot regret the outcome. Everything I endured was worth it to find you, to build this life, to discover that I had value I never knew existed. You taught me that I was worth more than gold, Kevin. You saved not just my freedom, but my soul. And their love, forged in the crucible of injustice and strengthened by shared adversity, continued to burn as bright and steady as the stars above their mountain home.